What they're finding from a neuroscience standpoint with mindfulness practices specifically is like it increases your threshold of tolerance. So like from a neurobiological standpoint, we have our prefrontal cortex, which gets bypassed in addiction, and the myelination. Mindfulness actually increases myelination on other neural pathways and gets other parts of the brain engaged in the process. So as we know, as your prefrontal cortex is more involved in the processing, and your amygdala downregulates, so your parasympathetic nervous system downregulates. So things that in early recovery felt like an 8 or a 9, we're working on helping them get that right-sized, right, in that 4 or 5 range even, which is way more manageable than a 9.
Hello, I am B. Reeves with New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families. Thank you. So we have Matt O'Connor today in from Abaya Wellness, where he is the founder and owner and a clinician in Durham, North Carolina. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you so much for having me, B. I'm really excited to sit with you again today in a different format.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be here, and I've gotten to know you professionally and personally over the last few years. But and just for those who are audio only, Matt O'Connor has the most amazing mustache I've ever seen outside the Guinness Book of World Records I used to look at as a kid. How long have you been growing that thing?
About 2.5 years, and it started as
COVID stash?
It was a COVID stash. We had a COVID like mustache growing competition at like a job, and by the end of it, I had like a little bit of a handlebar mustache, and then I shaved it once.
I hear you.
About 2.5 years ago.
It's solid, man.
It's a pretty solid stash. Fun fact.
Yeah, go ahead.
I won the North Carolina mustache competition.
I believe that. I do. Absolutely. That's like the least surprising thing I've heard in a while. What's the maintenance routine like for that thing?
Oh, too much.
Okay. Yeah. Well, how long? I mean, in the morning?
I think it took me like 20 minutes.
Okay.
25 minutes this morning.
And is that because you were going to be on camera on a podcast, or is this standard operating procedure?
Because I was going to be on a podcast. But like standard operating, I'd say 10 minutes. Okay. 10, 15 minutes every
It's pretty incredible. Good job.
Yeah,
good job.
I appreciate it.
Cool. So you tell us a little bit about, what is Abaya, and then we will kind of we'll go from there.
So we're a outpatient therapy center, and really founded on the values of mindfulness, and we're a mindfulness-based organization. And what that means for Abaya and what it means for our team is to be on staff or to be on my team, you have to have a daily mindfulness practice. And we really believe from a top down, our organization, to be a mindfulness-based organization, has to have staff and a team that is willing to engage in mindfulness. And so we're a gender-specific or gender-responsive intensive outpatient program in Durham, North Carolina. Currently, I think we're one of the only gender-specific programs in the Triangle. So as we know, treatment outcomes are better when you're treating specifically male and female clientele separately. And we really wanted to embrace that. And all of our groups have mindfulness-based practices incorporated into them. And we also have a group or individual psychotherapy practice that works outside of the intensive outpatient program.
Cool. And just for listeners and for me, how do you define mindfulness?
I think it got like this like what's referred to as the Mick mindfulness train of like, oh, it's just meditation. The way that we're looking at it or defining it is really practices that help increase self-awareness in our clients, but also for individuals, it doesn't necessarily need to be a formal sitting meditation practice, but the way in which we're working with our clients and as staff, we feel like a formal meditation practice is the best avenue for us to achieve a more mindful state. But it's really just a practice to grow in self-awareness.
Cool. I had lunch with one of your colleagues from Abaya recently, and I won't name his name. I don't want to embarrass him, but he has been in recovery, clean and sober, a very long time, and his new practice of mindfulness, due to your suggestion and requirement to be there, has completely changed his entire life from the inside out for the better.
Yeah, and I think people say mindfulness without like a full understanding of the different types of practices that are beneficial to different experiences that someone might be struggling with or really looking to improve upon. There's very specific practices which we work with the men on. There's very specific practices that we work with the women in our program on. And it's not like a blanket, like this will be good for this person or we get to actually individualize it. And I could go into like greater detail about all the different practices, but we're really looking at what would be most beneficial to people in early recovery, which is also different than like a normie sitting and trying to start a mindfulness practice. We're very raw and vulnerable and have a lot of emotions early on in the recovery process. So let's make sure that we're doing practices that help people really integrate their new recovery process and not activate them more, not put them in a position where they're so elevated or activated that, drinking and drugging feels like the best option in the moment. So it's super intentional the way we go about it and the practices we introduce to our clients. And I feel the same way with my staff, right? Is like what practices are most beneficial to this person growing and developing into a better helper. So we get to individualize it for our clients because we keep a super small group on both the men's and the women's side. And that allows us to really tailor someone's treatment process and their mindfulness-based experiential process to them.
Cool. One thing you just said reminded me of something I learned when I first got into recovery, which is the best thing about being in recovery is you feel your feelings. The worst thing about being in recovery is you feel your feelings. And it sounds like that what you're doing over there is helping people feel them without, like you said, triggering, activating, causing one to reach for the bottle or the drug as a solution to whether it's super high or super low. And then I guess that kind of ties into trying to live in the 4, 5, 6 instead of the super highs, 10s and super low 1s. Yeah.
And what they're finding from a neuroscience standpoint with mindfulness practices specifically is like it increases your threshold of tolerance. So like from a neurobiological standpoint, we have our prefrontal cortex, which gets bypassed in addiction, and the myelination. Mindfulness actually increases myelination on other neural pathways and gets other parts of the brain engaged in the process. So as we know, as your prefrontal cortex is more involved in the processing and your amygdala downregulates, so your parasympathetic nervous system downregulates. So things that in early recovery felt like an 8 or a 9, we're working on helping them get that right sized, right, in that 4 or 5 range, even, which is way more manageable than a 9.
Yeah. One, I know, so you work with not exclusively, but largely college kids, correct?
No, it's actually been mostly adults.
Oh.
So our placement directly between Durham and Chapel Hill, I was like, it's college students.
Right.
Like we're going to get college students. And with my professional history of working with young adults, adolescents, and I worked with young adults for a decade, right? And I was like, oh, like I won't brand it or any of that as like a young adult program. It is all adults and
That's
professionals,
amazing.
which has been really rewarding and a lot less resistance or struggle, right?
Right.
Of like a lot less of trying to convince people that like recovery is a good option. It's a lot less planting seeds for
Yeah.
later.
Right.
But I'd say our average age is 40.
Wow. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so for the intensive outpatient, it's 40 plus. And we also have the group practice of the individual therapy side. That is almost all like that is a lot of college students and young professionals like 35 and under, because they're just seeking individual therapy at the time. But our intensive outpatient is
Okay.
almost fully adults and
So
professionals.
IOP is average age 40. Individual therapy is skews more to college age.
Yeah, yeah. And I think because mental health and substance use therapy in general is becoming more accessible, but I think the one great thing that came out of COVID was the cultural, like, okayness. I do a lot of air quotes.
Yeah.
The cultural okayness with getting therapy. So we're seeing a lot of people, I believe, seek therapy at a younger age, and it's like, all right. And especially in the South of like,
Yeah.
the stigma around addiction and mental health, I think COVID has really lowered that for a lot of people. So we're seeing a lot of younger people seek therapy, I think, quicker.
I agree. I mean, I think COVID, a lot of probably mostly negative, but some positives. And one that seemed negative at first was all this addiction, mental health. But what I think it did was it bubbled up to the surface, something that was already there percolating.
Yep.
And just accelerated and exacerbated. And a lot of these people are getting help faster than they otherwise would have. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it isolated people a lot. And the thing about therapy that I've found most beneficial, I mean, I've been in therapy 20 years and pretty much weekly since then. Like, I don't know if I need therapy weekly at this point,
Right.
but I believe I do. It just because there's, COVID limited our connection so much that sitting with someone and our job as therapists is really to work on helping our client feel connected to us in that moment.
Yeah. It's kind of like what we were talking about when we were walking in.
Yeah.
We never know what one little thing we're doing that's been working for however long, and you pointed out to me when I said, I'm afraid if I take away that one thing that the whole sweater will unravel. And you reminded me that I don't have that much power. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. Right. And, I like try and take credit for the sweater. Right. Like
Right,
I
exactly.
sat down, I knitted it. I like made it.
Yep.
And like the reality is I had nothing to do with the making of the sweater in my recovery process. Right. Like that needed to be shown to me.
Exactly.
Like it's threads of, hundreds of people who have influenced that process.
Yeah. And I mean, sort of on the same note, when I'm superstitious about something, whether it's in golf or traffic or something, and I try to convince myself sometimes that it's just routine, which that's a thing.
Yeah.
But then when I realize it is superstitious, that's when I'm sort of crossing into that. How do I think I have the power to make something happen because of some silly superstition that I've developed over the last few years or my whole life, really? So you said you've been in therapy for 20 years, and just tell us where did you grow up? Tell me, how'd you end up where you are now?
I don't know. I joke a little. So I grew up in Buffalo, like I say Buffalo, New York. I grew up in a small little town called Silver Creek, not Creek, Crick.
Okay.
Just
Spelled Creek.
Okay. Yep. But I grew up in a town of like 2,000 people.
Oh, wow.
And my public high school I think we started the year with like 80 in my graduating class. And like it dropped down to like 68. Very rural, very poor. Comparatively poor, right? Like I think everybody's like lower working class. And I think that really shaped my viewpoint on work and things like that. A lot of that I'm super grateful for. So I grew up in that small town and everybody knew each other. We were all friends and just a very different environment than I think where I live now, whereas Durham, it's a city. And I don't necessarily feel like super useful to go into high school and all that, but a couple of interesting factors. My mom was 17 when she had me.
Wow.
So she was very young, and the experience for me growing up was like, I'm the it takes a village kid.
Yeah.
You know, like aunts, uncles, cousins, and I've 27 first cousins.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and we were at a family event this past weekend. My grandmother has 32 great grandchildren, just like Irish Catholic, like everybody's procreating, and so. Yeah, I graduated high school in like this rural small high school, and I was a kid with like so much potential. You know, like the teachers were like, if you just tried a little.
I'm very familiar with
Yeah. And little did I know, like I just wasn't that interested, right? Like in high school at the time, there wasn't a lot of things. Like the things that I was interested in was like art and music, and those things I did well in. Put me in a math class, and like I was in a remedial math class in high school, not because I wasn't intelligent, but just because that content didn't engage me. And I somehow like got to go play soccer for a semester, for my first semester of college, and I think that was the first time. I'm a person in recovery, as you know, and I think that was the first time that I chose drugs and alcohol over something that was really important to me. So it lasted that school, early college experience lasted a semester, and my father, I think he moved to New York City when I was like 12 or 13. My mom and my dad were never together, and so I got to have this experience of being from this like rural small town to like New York City. So I'd go and visit New York City, you know, a few times a year, stay for a week, 2 weeks, whatever. And that really opened my eyes to what was possible. So just to like think about, oh, like my life doesn't have to be this small town that's really centered around like alcohol, drugs, partying. Like there wasn't anything to do. We had a Rite Aid, right? Like a Rite Aid and a grocery store. There was a bowling alley also. But outside of that, you know, we're 50 minutes from any hobby that you could think of. So growing up was really like, I started working at a young age. My family loved the hell out of me, whether or not at the time I felt that way, you know, like typical teenage stuff. And but after I had that first semester, I got real sick because of drugs and alcohol. And I'd called my dad and I'm like, I'm sick and I don't know what's going on. And he's like, okay, move here. So I moved to New York City. And like
freshman year in college.
Yeah, freshman year in college. Had some boundaries around it. And so like I did all right for a minute and like went to community college for a while, did really well in community college, and the substance use was down a bit, just because I wasn't coming from a place where there were a lot of boundaries around like, oh, you can or can't do this. And I got into like a 4-year school. I got back into a 4-year school. I graduated and I started with like, I wanted to be a history teacher. I wasn't like, I'm going to be a therapist. And I
Were you a history major?
Yeah, I was.
Me too.
Oh, nice. Yep. I'm 1 credit away from having a history degree. So during that 4-year, well, it was at that point 2 or 3 years span, I got into therapy because I have like boundaries, then go back to school, no boundaries. Oh, hey, like I can do what I want again. And I got into therapy, and I had this amazing therapist who I'm like still super, she's the reason I'm a therapist, right? Like I was suffering and she sat with it. She just sat there with it. And during this time, I got sent on my first meditation retreat. I think some people get sent to treatment for some. I was getting sent to like meditation retreats because like my family was like, maybe
Sounds
this.
awesome.
It was great, and like my family was like, maybe this will help. Maybe
I mean, I
this will
definitely
help.
wouldn't have thought it was awesome when I was 18, but now it
Yeah,
sounds like a vacation.
yeah. Well, we can talk about that more. But it was like my first introduction to mindfulness practices, and so I had done like 3 retreats during that undergrad experience time.
One sec. Were you sober now?
No,
Okay.
definitely not sober.
Okay.
So I was going on these retreats and I'd have this span of time where like I'd grow drastically in insight and awareness and then into like, oh, like I'm starting to see that I could have an experience different than the level of suffering I feel on the daily basis with alcohol and drug addiction. And at one point, and I was like going into my last year of undergraduate, and she was like, have you ever thought about being a therapist? I'm like, what? I'm like, no. And she's like, there's this small Buddhist school in Colorado called Naropa that trains therapists at the graduate level. If you ever thought maybe you wanted to be a therapist. And I had taken a psych class, and I think we were probably talking about it in therapy. And she was like, you could be a history major and like go be a professor. And like, I wasn't psyched about like what I was actually studying at that time. She was like, you could just do what you feel passionate about. And I'm like, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Really? And she's like, yeah, like I needed that permission.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody was telling me to be a history major. Like I placed that on myself. And so my last year of college, I just took psych classes, got my psychology degree. And then I moved back to Buffalo, like the Buffalo area, and I did in-home crisis intervention. So I did that for like 4 years. But like the seed was planted of like this little Buddhist university. And I thought about like trying to go right away, but like, God had different plans at the time, or my higher power. And because I wasn't ready, like I was still in active addiction. I was still not doing all right. And then some circumstances led to the state of New York thinking it would be a good idea for me to not continue to use substances anymore. And
Gotcha.
so yeah, not that time is a relevant barometer, but Wednesday I have 13 years. So I'm a one chip wonder, right? Like I didn't know that like recovery existed.
Yeah.
Like I went on these retreats, and I went on some retreats that had recovery meetings at them. I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I sat in one of those recovery meetings and lied. Like, but it was like a Buddhist recovery meeting, right? And I lied. I was like, yeah, I've been sober for a little while. And like, but like there was part of me that knew that I needed to be sober. And I had never been to any 12-step meetings or anything, like, because it wasn't 12-step. It was just like some people in recovery who were on a retreat just being like, we're in recovery and we're on a retreat. So somehow during that time, I applied to Naropa, and in graduate school, I flew out to Colorado. I was late. I was late to my graduate interview, like still
a mess.
It's still a mess. And then I got into trouble, and New York was like, if you go to graduate school, we won't punish you. So like leave the state and you go to graduate school. And I just like to tell this story about my recovery because I really feel like it was one of the most palpable experiences of like me no longer having power. Like I got on a plane and I was going to stay with my grandfather's stepson, who I had never met in Colorado. And my grandfather flies me out to Colorado, and I'm going to stay with him until I find a place and things like that. And I walk in the door, and he's like, hey, I'm Pete. And I'm like, hey, I'm Matt. Pleasure to meet you. He's like, I'm 20 years sober. I'm like, because I'm going to Colorado, right? Like I'm like, I got away scot-free, even though I had 3 months at the time. I'm like, I got away scot-free. And he's like, you want to go to a meeting? And I'm like, yep, I sure do.
Were you already going to meetings at this
point? Yeah, I was going to meetings at that point. But just to save my butt.
And out of the gate. Welcome to your new life.
Welcome. And when I went to meetings, people were saying things that I felt. So it wasn't like I disconnected, but I was going to a meeting in a basement with 4 people, 60 plus, who because it was so rural, right? And 4 people, 60 plus, the same 4 people every day.
This was in Buffalo.
Yeah. And then one of the people was like, hey, let me drive you to some meetings. So he'd come 30 minutes out of his way to drive me 45 minutes to a meeting. So there were some more people and some more young people. And I was like, what do you want from me? What do you want from me? I just I didn't get it.
Yeah.
And he was like, you'll get it one day. Don't worry. Don't worry, lad.
Yep.
Right. So I'm back and forth between I started getting sober in Buffalo, but everybody at the time also was like, don't move to Colorado. I think that's important. And don't move to Colorado. Don't go to school. You're not ready. You're too early in recovery. And there was probably some truth to that, but I don't think if I stayed, my experience would have been different if I stayed there, right? If I stayed in the small rural area with no friends anymore because I was trying to do something different. And so I really I listened to my family. I didn't make that decision myself. My family was like, you need to get out of here. Get on it. You are getting on that plane. So got there and Pete brought me to a meeting and I was like, all right. And that was my first experience of seeing young people in recovery because I was 25. And I'm I'm going to Colorado. It's party time, right? It still wasn't fully I need to be sober. And that experience with Pete brought me to a young person's meeting and I walked into a room of 50 people of 25 and under. And I was like, oh, I'm good. I'll be okay.
It's funny how it's so important. It was for me. It sounds like you too, early to have people who are more our age, look have more shared experience. And, but over time, my experience has been that it's still refreshing to see somebody who maybe is around my same age who had a similar, college with something that outside of just being sober. But then the longer I'm around, the less important that is. And then now if I end up in some town where I'm traveling, find a meeting and it's just 4 old dudes, I'm happy about it.
I'm psyched.
But I'm brand new, I'd be like, oh my God, are you
what
kidding
is
me?
this?
What is this? What have I done?
And Colorado and Boulder specifically is such a treatment hub that there were young people with a lot of time, 25, 26-year-olds with 10 years, 8 years, 7. So it was a nice experience to see oh, it's possible, but also these people are inspiring, right?
Well, back to that, sorry to interrupt, but back to the working with young adults.
Yeah.
And I sort of makes sense, I think, that your population, at least in IOP, is not as young as you had anticipated, since it's when people are in treatment that age and they have activities and clinical, it's a lot easier to show people that life is great sober. But just telling people is a different animal.
Yeah, and we're not in a treatment destination.
Right.
I can't think there's not a residential, is there?
Not really.
In the triangle.
Not really. No, not really.
Not really right now. Right. And not a young adult specific.
No.
Green Hill and Aim where I was is the closest.
Not exactly residential, but a great
it's not
program,
a great program, not exactly res, and maybe they'll move there, and I hope they do, right? But that's it. In Boulder alone, there were 7 young adult treatment centers, specifically young adult, and that didn't include all the res for adults, right? And so, I think it is important. The thing that I found clinically now is, especially on the outpatient level, because I think res in transitional living and living, being with your people is super important. On the outpatient level, what we found, we get college students. And like having adults with lived experience who are reflecting like what this could look like if this younger person doesn't engage with recovery is so beneficial to the younger person. Like, let's get them connected and like get them the younger person, a recovery support network with people their age. But on the clinical level, like them having a mirror for like, I said the same thing and I'm sitting in the chair with you has been like vitally important to their like seeing it a little differently.
Yeah. It's funny when you were talking about how you went to New York as a 13-year-old and saw all this opportunity of there's so much more to life.
Yeah.
But in a positive way. I remember when I first started going to New York in high school, all I saw was like, hey, you can have weed delivered. I can go to bars early, like all the bad stuff.
Oh, I saw all that stuff. I think that's what I loved about it.
Okay. I was a little surprised to hear that you were like, oh, this opportunity.
No, like at 18 years old, you can walk into a bodega, right? Like, and there, nobody's IDing you or asking questions. Like, I did love that part of it too. I just think like when we talk like rural areas, like there wasn't an AA meeting in my town. There was one therapist.
Yeah. The town therapist,
right? And there was like one family of color. And you go to New York and you just like, we didn't have restaurants, right? Like there was a McDonald's or a Burger King. It wasn't. So like you go to New York and you see like, holy cow, like this is really a true melting pot and there's opportunity to do whatever you want. Like, I think it was like a first switch of like, oh, like you can have hobbies if you live somewhere else. There's access to more things. So I think that was the light switch. And like, it wasn't long before I found the guy who was selling pot in Times Square and like the local bodega that never ID'd me and things like that.
Yeah. Remember, I was sitting in a bar in New York in the West Village. I lived there for about 5.5 years.
Oh, okay.
And I knew the guy. I didn't know his wife that well. We were all sitting around drinking on a Sunday watching a Panthers game. And she said jokingly, but when she said it, it was almost, it rang true. She said, there's really nothing to do in New York other than drink. And I mean, she was kind of kidding, but also when that's all you care about, which is pretty much all I cared about. I mean, I would definitely go see bands and stuff like that. But, the biggest city in America, the cultural capital of America, if not the world. And I mean, I did almost nothing cultural other than go see I go see bands.
Yeah.
Other than that, I worked and I drank and I partied and I slept. And, and now when I go back, I've been back to New York, I think 3 times sober. It is amazing. It's amazing. It's like going there as a kid with my dad when I went to Broadway plays and all the sights, and living there for all that time. I mean, I almost did none of that.
I had never seen a skyscraper. Like Buffalo doesn't have skyscrapers. Like that's the closest. Like I had never seen a skyscraper. I had never seen a national monument. Like there were museums in the same way, like small little art museums in Buffalo. But I mean, it's a Rust Belt city. I mean, it's on the come up now. But when I lived there, it was, even Buffalo didn't have a lot. Like we've got the Bills, we've got the Sabres, and like we've got a lot of bars. So going to New York, it was like, wow. And, I'll talk for a moment about graduate school because I think in the context of like seeing where I started to go on retreat, I was 3 months sober and I started my graduate program against everybody's advice. And I get there and they're like, okay, next week we're going on retreat. So like retreat was built into my graduate program. We went on a 2-week retreat every semester. Wow. And so I'm 3 months sober and that's very different than the other times I went on retreat. And then I go on retreat as part of my graduate program for 2 weeks.
Silent retreat?
Silent, pretty much silent. I mean, I think we spent 7 days on that first retreat silent, but it's like 6 or 7 hours of meditation a day at 3 months sober. Like you want to talk about suffering and like really getting intimate with your mind really quickly in your body. I think retreat and like that school were just as important to my recovery process early on as going to recovery groups. And people might disagree with that sentiment, but that was my experience. I don't recommend going on retreat at 3 months sober to anybody. Like that was, but like the container was so tight.
Yeah.
And we're like in the middle of the mountains, in the middle of nowhere with no way to leave. Like if you leave, you are out of the program. You are not allowed to leave site. So there was no inherent risk in like my recovery with going other than like me leaving. And I think on that first retreat, 2 people left because they had detox, because they had substance use issues, right? So they just left. They were just
didn't
like,
have the courage, or
they were just like,
deal with it, and they showed up, and then they were gonna get sick or worse.
They were getting sick, and like the teachers were like, "Are you gonna stay or are you gonna go?" And 2 people left.
Wow.
So yeah, 2 weeks, and man, like I was angry. I mean, like that was the first time where I like
talk about feeling your feelings.
Talk about feeling your feelings, and then sitting there and feeling them for 6 hours a day.
I mean,
like
yeah.
So
when I started meditating, when I first got sober, I was, it was suggested, but I was like, how am I supposed to do this? I'm so crazy, but all these thoughts running through my head. How am I expected to do this? And people's answer was, you think you're the only person who thinks he's nuts?
Yeah.
Just try it for 45 seconds. That's where I started. But I mean, out of the gate, 3 months sober,
2-week meditation.
That sounds amazing in hindsight, but but to your point, don't recommend it, but it probably is more powerful than going to meetings and checking boxes for those first few months. Just really getting to live with yourself and sit with yourself for that long. It's amazing.
And there was no like external thing that I could blame in that moment, right? Like there was no like, if this experience was different, if this person was different, if only in that moment, the only person who I was sitting with was myself. And there's a lot of beauty in that, like awareness, and like it's terrifying.
Yeah.
And not that I was like, I need to change this and take personal responsibility for it, blah, blah, blah. Like that's not what meditation's about. It's just being, right? It's sitting with yourself in all the discomfort and all the suffering and grace and beauty and happiness and joy, right? Like I was shut down to all emotions. Anger was the easiest one to come back. And
it's funny. I mean, the anger part of, and my meditation, I don't do specifically mindfulness, but my attitude is all meditation is good. There's no real wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
And I was selling software when I started I've been meditating kind of freestyle for about a year and a half, using apps and doing it just on my own for a few minutes a night, 10 minutes in the morning, but always twice a day.
Yeah.
And then I started doing what I've been doing now for a little over 4 years. And in my job, I had this sales manager, and I'd get off a call and I would yell, not at the person I was talking to, but as soon as the call was over. And a lot of it was to let off steam, to be funny, but it was still very, it's angry, and it was a lot of profanity. And then it was probably a month after I'd started doing, the kind of meditation I've been doing now transcendental meditation. And she just said, hey, and she knew I was doing it because she let me leave to go to the TM Center of the Triangle in Durham every day for 4 days for a little while. And she just said, I noticed you haven't yelled at anybody in a while. And that was kind of the first thing that I hadn't even noticed myself, that somebody else had noticed what it was doing for me.
And I'd say like early on, that meditative experience, when people are like, there isn't a right or a wrong way, like there's part of me that agrees with it and there's part of me that doesn't.
Okay, explain.
I don't think it's useful to sit there and beat yourself up. without like,
right. I mean, I wouldn't consider that meditation in the first place.
but people do.
Right.
Or like the idea that like you need to be calm, otherwise you are
Right.
doing it wrong.
No, well, my thing is, if
and then there's like all that judgment, and like they just sit there and judge themselves and judge themselves. So if you don't have any formal like practice or structure to it, and not to say like practice needs to be super structured and rigid, because like I don't think that's the foundation of practice. But there should be some form to it, right? And you were saying
agree.
that
as long as everybody has a practice that they are willing to do that, and that's kind of my point. Because, like you just said, people do have this misconception that we're supposed to sit down, close our eyes, and just go to this Zen, calm place, and that may happen sometimes for me. But sometimes,
once a month,
I think about stuff I don't want to be thinking about, but I'm at least willing to engage in the practice. And it's back. I mean, willingness is probably to me the most powerful word in recovery. Willingness backed up by action.
And I think one of the things you were talking about there of like the calm or like noticing some of the defects coming up on the work level, for me, mindfulness helped bring awareness, but didn't always immediately change the action. And that's where like working a recovery program, I do believe really streamlined and put more structure to growth. And more structure to like where mindfulness brings the awareness. Now, what do I do with it?
Right.
Like, what do I do with this awareness?
Right.
And recovery is like this.
Right. 6 and 7 here.
6 and 7. Here you go. And so like we did those 2-week meditation retreats every semester and moved more into different types of practices. And so I'm a contemplative psychotherapist. Like that's my training. That's the name of my master's degree. So when we're saying mindfulness, like I feel like it can sometimes do a disservice, but it's not. Like there's so much beauty and structure and practices. It's not just sitting and doing Vipassana. There's a lot of history and not all of it's good. And learning about the history of practice and mindfulness and meditation. And so over the course, I did a 3-year master's program. The first year, I think I spent a month. I did a month on retreat. The second year, I was on retreat for 2 months that year. And then the third year, the same. I was on retreat for 2 months that year.
How did you find this place?
That therapist.
Oh, that's right.
Right. Like that therapist who was like, because I was going on these weekend meditation retreats during my undergrad, because my dad and my stepmom were like, you might like this. And I was studying with a teacher at the time who, has had stuff come out since. So I'm not like, but I kept going on retreat with him and beginning to formulate like a relationship to the practice and the teachings. And that was super helpful for me. Similar to like in AA where you get a sponsor, in 12-step recovery where you get a sponsor, like there's a reason we do that. It's useful, right? It's useful to have guidance. It's useful to have someone who knows me well and can be like, yeah, this is what you're not seeing right now.
And it's also important to recognize and understand that these sponsors and mentors, they're human beings. They're not perfect.
No.
Sometimes they can carry the message better than anybody, but they are maybe more flawed than some others, Well,
I don't think it's useful to rely on one person for anything.
Sure.
I got a person in my recovery circle for everything, right? Like I got a relationships person, I've got a money person, I've got a home improvement person, right? Like
it's true. Because I never thought about it like that, but I do too.
And I think the same goes for our spiritual growth. Like we should have people who inspire us in different areas of our life.
I agree.
So yeah, and after grad school, I was like, I'm not gonna be that dude in recovery who just works with addiction. I'm like, I'm not doing it. And my internship, I feel like I'm a good therapist, right?
That's what we hear.
I mean, that's what people say at least. And like, I do have confidence and a lot of that comes from my experience, not just, I think I was trained very, very well. I think Naropa itself in relation to training therapists is one of the best institutions in the country. It's just so different than what we see as traditional education. My first year, I didn't learn how to work with clients at all. It is, you just work on yourself. That is it.
That's awesome.
Like, you are going to work on yourself for a year. You're going to get all your crap out of the way so you can figure out how to sit with people. So,
I think that I've never heard anybody describe that experience in grad school. I didn't go to grad school. I don't have any credentialing or anything, but I'm around this stuff a lot. But it kind of comes back to that analogy I certainly use, and I'm sure you do too, of when we get on a plane, the flight attendant shows us how to put the mask on ourselves before we can help the person next to us. It seems like another example of that.
Well, if you think about when you were like 3 months sober, and say you went on a retreat, you went on that retreat, right? That I went on. If I'm with that level of suffering internally, like my own discomfort, which was probably a 4, but felt like a 10, what couldn't I sit with a client?
Exactly.
And we sit with our deepest, darkest thoughts and beliefs, and on retreat, like, there's nothing often that could sit in front of me. There's a couple of things that still, I think, get that spot where I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can help. But there's very few things where someone can sit across from me in my office where I'm like, I can't sit with that.
Right. I hear you. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tell us, we're going to put all your information up, but how do we find you, Matt?
So the best way is to look on our website, abayawellness.com. You can find me there. We'll get all the information up there. Also, and our main line is the easiest way to get in contact with any of us.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and have a great weekend.
I appreciate you asking me to come, and it's always fun to sit with you.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
Thank you.